Good morning, it's Tuesday, the 12th of September here in London. This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Europe podcast. I'm Caroline Hepker. Coming up today, JP Morgan boss Jamie Dimon calls for more humility from regulators as he slams their capital plans. Apple gears up for a high-stakes iPhone launch as fears of a China backlash grow. And we take a closer look at Thierry Breton, the EU enforcer who wants big tech to play by his rules. Let's start with a roundup of our top stories. JP Morgan CEO Jamie Dimon has taken aim at US regulators, calling plans to hold more capital than international competitors a, quote, huge negative. And Dimon didn't stop there, pointing out that the Fed needs to be more aware of their own mistakes.
The Federal Reserve should have a little humility. They're the ones that told the world rates aren't going up. It wasn't the Federal Reserve in general. It was each one of them independently. In fact, it was each central bank. So if I were them, I'd have a little more humility over stuff like this.
Jamie Dimon's comments come as federal agencies push ahead with plans to require banks to add billions of dollars to their capital cushions after a number of smaller US lenders collapsed earlier this year. The Federal Reserve is done raising interest rates and will likely cut them by roughly 1 percentage point next year. That's according to chief economists at some of North America's largest banks. Bloomberg's Charlie Pellet reports.
The latest forecast from the American Bankers Association's Economic Advisory Committee shows while the U.S. will probably dodge a recession, economic growth looks set to slow markedly in coming quarters, pushing up unemployment while reducing inflation. According to their median forecast, the committee sees economic growth slowing to less than an annualized 1% rate in the coming 3 quarters in response to the Fed's past interest rate increases and a tightening of credit conditions. In New York, Charlie Pellet, Bloomberg Radio.
Now, Bank of England policymaker Catherine Mann says that more rate hikes should be on the cards in the UK. The most hawkish member of the Monetary Policy Committee warned that it's easier to fix a flagging economy than persistently high inflation. The Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, told Bloomberg that price rises are weighing on fiscal decisions too.
When you're trying to bring down inflation, you have to be really careful not to pump extra money into the economy, much as you would like to, not to pump extra money into people's pockets, because that can push up prices and keep inflation higher for longer. So the one thing I can absolutely say is that our focus at the autumn statement will be on bringing down inflation.
Jeremy Hunt added that if the UK didn't improve its economic growth, taxes will rise. And you can hear the full interview with the Chancellor on the UK Politics podcast. Apple will attempt to regain the narrative later today with the launch of a new iPhone, updated Apple Watch and AirPods. The launch comes as the Cupertino firm confronts fears of a consumer backlash in China after Beijing banned government employees from using iPhones at work. Heyman Capital Management founder and CIO Carl Bass says he thinks Apple faces a rough ride in the country.
I think Apple is in for, let's just say, a much longer period of distress in China. And I think you've seen Apple try to move to India on the production side, and they've been successful in moving a very large portion of their production in a very short period of time. I just think that's going to be something that they're going to have to do.
Carl Bass spoke to Bloomberg as the tech giant renewed a contract to get modem chips from Qualcomm. The deal is a sign that Apple's efforts to build its own components is taking longer than expected. Bloomberg has learnt that ARM's initial public offering is already oversubscribed by 10 times, and bankers plan to stop taking orders later today. That's a day earlier than planned. The offer for the British chip designer owned by SoftBank could end up 15 times oversubscribed, and shares are due to start trading in the US on Thursday. The former head of MI6 says that the UK needs to remain and maintain a dialogue with China. Sir Richard Dearlove's intervention comes after a parliamentary researcher was arrested on suspicion of spying for Beijing, something that he denies. Britain's former spy chief says that the situation needs to be handled delicately.
This issue is not black and white. You can be tough with China and you can show China that you mean business when they interfere in your internal affairs, but you can also trade with them. Look, this is not a Cold War with China.
The former head of MI6's comments come as senior Tory MPs lined up in the House of Commons to pressure the Prime Minister to designate China as a threat to the UK. Responding to the initial story, Rishi Sunak called the relationship with Beijing a, quote, challenge, but stopped short of going any further than that. Dangerous concrete has been discovered in the Houses of Parliament, adding to the list of the buildings affected. Bloomberg's Ewan Potts reports now.
Crumbling public buildings have been a big PR headache for Rishi Sunak's government. Now the contentious form of concrete that's forced over 100 schools to close has been found in the Houses of Parliament. Mitigations will be put in place after a routine inspection uncovered so-called reinforced rack. Bloomberg understands that structural engineers assess there is no immediate risk. The discovery of rack on the parliamentary estate adds to a growing list of ageing buildings causing major political trouble for the Conservatives. In London, I'm Ewan Potts, Bloomberg Radio.
Now, though, to the question of Apple. Its annual iPhone unveiling is going to happen today, and usually an unusual amount riding on the outcome. The iPhone 15 is going to be unveiled today in California. So joining me this morning is Quick Takes Alex Webb. Good morning, Alex. Great to have you on the programme. What are we expecting then from the new products, especially the price and the sales that they could garner?
So the actual, hardware itself, as we've seen in recent years, the upgrades are sort of more iterative. There's no sort of, at least to my mind, blockbuster new leap. There'll be slightly thinner bezels around the edge. There's going to be a USB-C port rather than a Lightning port for charging. That is kind of not really Apple's own choice. That's been pushed by regulation in the European Union. And there'll be a few sort of what they call and try not to cringe at this name, the dynamic island in the Pro models, which is the little sort of thing that replaced the notch at the top of the phone. That's going to be going into all models. But as you say, the key thing is going to be price, and in the Pro models, there's going to be titanium shells, which will let them charge presumably a more premium price, and that's partly to your point then about sales. We have seen stagnating unit sales. What they're then trying to do is eke more dollar out of the units they are able to sell, therefore more premium pricing.
Okay, so if the unveiling and the kind of annual event today may not be huge, what about Apple and whether it has a China problem or not?
Yeah, I mean, look, we don't quite know yet, but there is concern that there might be, essentially. What we've seen in the past few weeks, reports, not least from our colleagues, that the Chinese state-owned agencies and companies, you're not allowed to own an iPhone as your work phone, essentially, in those contexts. Now, that in and of itself is not going to be significant for unit sales. The question is whether there is a broader issue with Chinese nationalism pushing people towards buying domestic manufactured handsets and away from iPhones. And in the past, this has hurt Apple on occasion, but after each instance, iPhone sales have rebounded in that country. And in fact, China's been a relatively bright spot for them, where other companies have seen declining sales there. Apple has been able to recover a little bit. But that is certainly something that people are watching. It's not something that Tim Cook will comment on today. It's probably something we're going to have to wait until the next quarterly earnings call to get any real visibility over.
Okay. The industry-wide slowdown, though, in smartphone demand, it's not just Apple, is it?
No, and frankly, Apple's been doing better than a lot of the competition. The sales at Samsung have declined a lot more significantly than at Apple. If you look at the second quarter of 2022, Samsung had 22% market share. It now has 20% market share. In that time, Apple's market share has increased by a percentage point. So we have seen it actually benefit from the travails of its biggest competitor. And crucially, it's that pricing point, that Samsung tends to play in the slightly less premium category. It does still have some offerings up in the high end, but that really is dominated by Apple, and that's where the pricing point really comes into play.
Yeah, okay, really interesting. Alex, thank you so much for being with me this morning. Quick Takes Alex Webb there, looking ahead then to Apple's Apple's annual iPhone unveiling in California. Well, Alex was mentioning that it was Europe that influenced Apple's charging system. Attitudes to US tech really are a big deal. And Thierry Breton is the bold, sometimes brash European politician who's made himself actually the face of a long list of legislation affecting big tech, particularly big tech in the US. Bloomberg's Gillian Deutsch has been looking into the man who wants big tech to play by his rules. Gillian, good morning. Thank you so much for being with us. This is a very interesting piece. For anyone who doesn't know, who is Thierry Breton?
That's a great question, and thanks so much for having me. As Alex just mentioned, this USB-C charger, this is something that actually not just the EU, but really Thierry Breton championed. So it's a great segue there. He is a former telecom CEO, former French finance minister, and even a best-selling sci-fi author. But now he is the European Union's biggest tech regulator. He has a title of the Internal Market Commissioner. And this has really given him leeway to step into a whole bunch of topics. So you see him talking about vaccines, energy, but really some of the most notable legislation that he is a part of is the Digital Services Act, which is really policing how platforms police content on their platforms. And the Digital Markets Act, which is a whole new list of antitrust rules. And like you mentioned, he's really made himself the face of these rules to big tech companies. And they really see him as kind of this new age of not just clipping their wings, clipping American tech wings, but really championing new legislation that actually benefits European companies.
Yeah, that is really interesting. How is his approach different then from other EU politicians and people in Brussels? How is he viewed?
It's interesting. So I guess probably the best comparison is Margaret Vestager. So anyone who's really ever followed any kind of European tech legislation or any of these, infamous antitrust or tax cases coming out of Brussels, it's been Vestager behind them. She was even labeled the American-hating tax lady once by former U.S. President Donald Trump. But Breton has really kind of taken that title of EU digital enforcer away from Vestager, not only because she's just gone on leave to take another job or to vie for another job, but even before that, over the past 3.5 years, he's really made himself the face of this legislation, and he's also, really kind of pushed the boundaries of this legislation, and in part by writing, rules that actually give more advantages to European tech companies, but also he has a very different personality. Vestager has this kind of intimidating calm, and she presents very carefully crafted lawsuits, whereas Breton is quite brash. He really keeps CEOs on their toes. It's very unpredictable. He's definitely a character here in Brussels that has been quite divisive.
Yeah, and so how's he seen by companies and CEOs?
So companies and CEOs tend to write him off sometimes as another anti-American tech regulator. But at the same time, they obviously see tons of legislation coming out of the EU. I mean, beyond this, the DSA and DMA, you've got cybersecurity rules, you've got artificial intelligence rules coming up. He's really the one who spearheaded the CHIPS Act, for example, here in Brussels. So they also are really trying to make it clear to him that they're taking him very seriously, and he believes them.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond. Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts. You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com. Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa device. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.